one of the people that the Menzies Foundation most enjoys working with is Mark Cabaj. I don't know how many of you know Mark Cabaj from here to there. Every time I speak to Mark Cabaj, I learn something. We've talked a lot today about evaluation. Why this is key is if you can't describe what you're doing or you can't explain what impact you're having, it's very hard to build the narrative around support. So the sorts of ways, the building evaluation or an impact framework or focusing on that as a key deliverable for this work is, I have found in my experience, to be absolutely and imperative. This is another quote I've got above my desk because I think this goes to the very heart of what we're talking about today, and which is why I really want to share what Mark Cabaj is going to talk about. First and foremost, evaluation must be seen and positioned as a key supporter of strategy. It's not about acquittal. It's not about saying you've done what you said you do. It lies at the heart of strategy. It should have a seat at the strategy table. To be honest, the only data that's useful is the data that informs your strategy, in my experience. Traditionally, it's not viewed in this way. It's considered as a separate component, usually after strategy has been developed or implemented, and an emphasis on strategic learning fundamentally changes it. And when you look at the data in the Australian... So I think evaluation, impact framework, strategy is absolutely at the heart of this work for those reasons. And yet the 2020 report basically concluded, and once going to be interesting to see if we do it again, what the data is going to say, but basically it said over the 5 years from 14 to 20, there was an increased understanding of the importance of evaluation, but a lack of confidence from both philanthropists and the not-for-profit sector on how to do this optimally, and more and really profoundly, a reluctance by philanthropy to fund and engage with the challenges and complexity of evaluative practice. The 2020 report said, despite increased importance, grant makers prioritise evaluation less than grant seekers. There's still a mismatch between that. Both parties were more comfortable evaluating over the 5 years, but mostly in programmatic ways, but not at all confident about complex and hard to measure issues, which lies at the heart of the sort of things that I think Ingrid's talking about. About half of the grant makers and grant seekers had evaluation frameworks, but only 10% of them had confidence in them. I mean, that is just a serious disaster. Since 2014, grant seekers have improved their evaluation practices, becoming more experienced and confident and skilled than grant makers, which was great. But despite the importance of an evidence base, grant makers' use of strategy remains low and has not improved over the 5 years. Fundamentally, understanding the social impact of grant making is growing, but boards, once again we come back to boards, still resist high support for evaluation. So with that in mind, Nathan, we've got to put on Mark Cabaj's video now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Cabaj, and I'm joining you today from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, on the western side of the country, which is also Treaty 6 country. And I'm pleased to join you today, although I would rather do it in person. This is the next best thing I get to do it via Zoom. And I would like to thank Liz Gillies for inviting me to contribute to this session, to Sarah Jenkins for helping me get ready for it. But also like to say hello to those of you who I know and have met in one of my previous visits to Australia, thanks largely to Collaboration for Impact and a lot of their allies and partners. Nice to see you again. And very keen to talk about this topic that Liz gave me permission to speak about. And the topic today is that I'd like to focus on is understanding and evaluating results in efforts to change systems underlying complex issues. And I will put the PowerPoint on now while letting you know that what I'm about to say today is not likely to be counterintuitive, because I think it makes sense, but it is countercultural. So I'm going to jump in because I only have 20 minutes. I asked for an hour and I was told to smarten up and only take 20, so that's what I'm going to take. Zombie practices and their better alternatives is based on the idea that the way we think about and evaluate systems change is based on old paradigms of design and strategy and really old paradigms of evaluation. And because of that, a lot of the practices that we use, things like logic models and measurements, etc., actually are zombie practices. They keep coming back no matter what, but they're no longer fit for purpose or useful. And I'd like to offer you some better alternatives. So some more of these ideas are touched on my website and other websites. If you're interested in more, you can go explore these. But here are the ideas that I want to explore with you today. Understanding three systems change, three foundational ideas to understand the dynamic of systems change before we even begin to evaluate it. The work of evaluating systems change, three zombie practices, and there's many, many more, but we're going to focus on three and their better alternatives. And then a little bit of time for you to discuss the implications possibly of these ideas for your work. So number one, understanding systems change, three foundational ideas. I want to quote two very helpful change leaders who know what they're talking about. Karen Pittman, the CEO of the Forum on Youth Investment at a Tamarack event that I helped run in 2014, I think, came up with this poetic Nobel Prize worthy quote that programmatic interventions help people beat the odds, systemic interventions change their odds. If we're in the game of systems change, I mean, of moving population level needles on complex issues, we are unavoidably going to work on systems. Francis Wesley from the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience says something similar, that if we want to get real deep and durable progress on complex challenges, we actually have to keep the systems that not only keep those challenges in place, but keep reproducing poor outcomes. So we could say a lot about this, but I think the first idea is pretty clear. The why of systems change is strong. We're just working on how. The next point is a bit more nuanced, but again, not counterintuitive, is that changing system is a time-intensive, clumsy, and contested process. I have here a visualization, my visualization of a very interesting change initiative around payday lending reform in Calgary, Alberta. Just south of me, I'm in Edmonton, and the source of that story is on the bottom right. You can double click on the PowerPoint when you get it. And what we did is we tracked over 10 years all the things, or not even all of them, many of the things that a coalition of organizations in Calgary did to reduce the number of people offering payday loans, which was problematic because payday loans, at least in Canada, I'm sure it's the same in Australia, typically run percentages of 600% of interest, 600% interest. So in order to reduce that, this group, a coalition of groups, worked for 10 years and achieved a whole series of wins in the area of municipal bylaws and provincial legislation, and eventually going for federal legislation. And to do so, they actually worked across multiple scales on mutually reinforcing activities over time. They had one heck of an organizing strategy to shift awareness and culture in the city of Calgary and the province around the case for doing something about predatory lending. And they had a whole series of individual policy wins at the local and provincial level, including a big win, which was a provincial act on predatory lending. Now, the impact of those systems changes could be quantified in many cases, including that Alberta now has the lowest payday lending rate in all of Canada of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. The number of payday lending institutions dropped from 230 to 165. And depending how you cut it, anywhere from $55 to $285 million in saved lending costs. There's a lot more to the story, and I wish I could tell you about it, but this is just an impressionistic painting in a way that reaffirms that this is pretty clumsy work. There was a lot of setbacks here. It took a lot of time, and it took mutually reinforcing activities across multiple scales with incremental outcomes that accumulated over time to generate an impact. That's the nature of this game. And if we can't handle this, we shouldn't play the game of systems change. This is unavoidable. It's not for the faint of heart because it is rough. Third, there are actually different kinds of outcomes in systems change. And I gave you a little summary of an article I wrote on this multiple years ago, and I wrote it really quickly, and it happened to be a pretty popular article, at least in Canada. And it said, when you're thinking about outcomes and people say results, I know that when I've done evaluation, I have heard at least 9 different kinds of outcomes, and they're all important, but it's really clear to me what kind of outcomes we're trying to track. And all of them have something to offer us. Stream number 1 is outcomes about strategic learning. What are we learning about what we're doing and thinking and how we are being? And I'm not going to really go into that on this call. I'd encourage you to read the paper, but most of the big outcomes I've seen in systems changes are when people go, holy gosh, the learning from this process is so dramatic that we're going to upgrade our strategy, which eventually leads to better results. So learning is a stream. Systems change is a stream. And there's lots of ways of evaluating systems change. Many of you will have frameworks in front of you that you find useful. I like thinking about the following. Can we track a change in the driver of a system behavior, an increase in investment, a change in policy, a change in authority in who's making decisions or how decisions are made? There's a whole bunch of drivers of systems behaviors, and we should track that. Number two, we should also track whether or not those changes in policies, resource flows, authority, or networks, etc., actually encourage a change in behavior of system actors. I've got lots of stories of people changing policies, but seeing no systems change, increasing investments or offering investments in new areas, but not seeing any systems change or any change in actor behavior. Finally, one from a systems change point of view could ask, have we changed the overall behavior of the system? Not just actors, but overall, does the systems change in a way that aligns with their desired impact? There's a case study in here about the Housing First model, which is an approach to supporting people who are homeless. And I know in that case, there's been lots of instances of drivers changing, behaviors of individual actors, and clearly overall changes in system behavior. And finally, around outcomes or impacts, there's lots of ways of talking about this. People also ask for how many individuals were affected. Are we seeing changes in targeted or geographic groups? And are these big enough to see some kind of net improvement for population level outcomes? So I'm not prescribing this. I like this framework, but you may have others. But we actually have to acknowledge that when we talk about results or outcomes and systems change, there's multiple results. So let's be clear about that again. The case is strong for systems change. This is a clumsy, contested process that unfolds over time, and that when we're tracking it, there's a lot of things that we could track or evaluate. Two, I want to talk more specifically about the evaluation process of this, and I've entitled the subtitle here is Overcoming Zombie Practices. Here's the big challenge, and it's a little bit theoretical for some, but it's very real for anyone in the field. When you understand the history of evaluation, it was actually developed in the 50s and 60s and early 70s when we were developing projects and programs and models that we hoped like crazy we would develop and test and then scale if they were appropriate. And these programs tended to be smaller scale, time limited, narrowly focused on one or two things, heavily measurement centric. In fact, when you look at most systems change efforts, they're an entirely different game. There's multiple actors and actions, each making distinct contributions. The strategy is emergent, adaptive, and ever evolving. Some of the strategies and the work itself is non-linear. It's not just do this and watch what happens, as suggested in a logic model. It is we do this, this happens, we adapt, and we may or may not see an effect. It's about cumulative changes over time. It happens across multiple scales, neighborhood, municipality, state or province, etc. Most often resisted, always generates a splatter of effects, and the tipping points when we see big wins are only really clear in retrospect. You may use different language, but you understand that these are two different games. Most evaluation thinking and methods are based on small-scale linear project that somehow we thought if we applied them on steroids, they would work. But in fact, they create a whole bunch of perverse consequences. And I've had to learn my way through this. So have you. And what we actually need are some better alternatives. So here's the approach I'm going to take. We do have to identify, acknowledge, and deal with these zombie practices, things that emerged in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s that we thought were really good for programmatic interventions, but they're no good for systemic interventions. Yet, despite that, we keep doing them because we have these habits, we're resistant to change, and we don't have alternative approaches. But as you'll see in the following couple of slides, they generate some really perverse outcomes, and we want to deal with those. I'm actually writing a book on this right now, and so I'm going to touch on three of the practices that I think are worthy of noting, even though there's at least four more. Well, there's for sure four more and many more after that. Here's the first one. Capturing unintended effects. The reality of working in systems change is when you intervene into a system, we generate a splatter of effects. What that means is some of the effects that we want to see are intended and some of them are unintended. But there's a lot of them. You intervene and a whole bunch of stuff happens, not just the stuff that you hope we'll see. The zombie practices that we employ that create problems for this are goal-oriented evaluation, only focusing on the achieving the targets or goals that we want to see, and spending all our money on pre-post studies, looking at a baseline of something we want to check and looking at changes over time, and then hopefully coming up with some kind of assessment about whether we contributed to whatever changes we see. The perverse consequences are nicely captured in the video that some of you have seen before called Moonwalking Bears. And the video itself is actually two different teams of people, one dressed in white and one dressed in black, and both of them who launch into this Harlem Globetrotters sharing of basketballs while they're dribbling and ducking and weaving. And you watch that show and it looks pretty interesting. It lasts about 20 seconds. And then they back up the reel and they say, did you see the moonwalking bear? And sure enough, because we're now looking for it, we see in the video some person who's in a black bear suit being a goofball and doing a moonwalking session in the middle of the video, in the middle of the basketball show. Now, it's a good metaphor because it means that we really have a hard time seeing things that we're not intently looking for. But if we're told to look for them, we find them. In complex change efforts, there's moonwalking bears everywhere. But because we're so focused on just seeing the outcomes that we want to see and doing our darndest to find evidence for those, that we miss all these other moonwalking bears. And some of them are unimportant and some of them are. The negative effects of not seeing them, though, is that we miss negative effects, we miss positive effects, and we diminish the people, the experience of different stakeholders who different things, and we may alienate them because we're not paying attention to the things that they want to see. One of the classic examples of this is economic empowerment programs for women in both developed and lesser developed countries, where one of the unintended effects was consistently that the empowerment of women on civic literacy, on economic development, and the increase in their income and assets disrupted power relationships in the home, which often led to abusive situations. This is no longer an unintended effect, but it sure was in the early days of the program, and goal-oriented approaches would have missed that entirely. So what are the alternatives for this? Well, the better alternatives are using goal-free evaluation, asking what has changed rather than did we achieve our results. Participatory wide net methods, which ask stakeholders to tell us everything that has happened, not just the things that we see. And some of the methods there are ripple effect mapping, most significant change, and outcome harvesting, and employing both post-pre and pre-post designs. Post-pre is you say, here's the baseline of the things we're tracking, and we're going to use all our money to track changes on that baseline. Pre-post is you actually have some budget and some mechanism to go chase a moonwalking bear if and when it emerges. In the case of that empowerment program for economic empowerment program for women, if we got a hint, some kind of weak signal that there's abusive situations going on, we'd actually have the time, resources, and energy and the mechanism to go chase that to investigate it more deeply. Okay, systems change, challenge number 2. This should say challenge number 2, my apologies. Tracking systems change or measuring systems change. This one is a very deep cultural bias we have in the West, and we need a cultural, an ideological exorcism about it. And this is from a guy who loves measurement. How do we meaningfully track and understand the diverse and nuances changes in the systems that we hope that will lead to desired impact? Well, the practices are measure it solely with quantification type designs. Focus on shared measurement, a couple shared measurement that are supposed to synthesize changes across really diverse initiatives and contexts, using of dashboards and KPIs, key progress indicators. I'm not going to argue against these because they do have their place, and I don't want to raise hackles, but I want to say by themselves, they actually generate really perverse consequences, and these are well documented. I give you a source here on a paper that I wrote a while ago called Shared Measurement 3.0. And here's a summary of some of the research that has been done on the perverse consequences of shared measurement. You focus on the things that are easiest to measure and ignore the rest. You focus your efforts on short-term targets at the expense of longer-term objectives. When outcomes are difficult to measure, you focus on outputs, which replace outcomes, on and on and on. So a narrow emphasis on measurement by itself for systems change, which are largely qualitative in nature, but also sometimes quantifiable, leads to these perverse consequences. On the right-hand side is an example of what I'm suggesting is a useful way to go, which is using a case study format with a mixed methods design. We might call it no narratives without numbers, no numbers without narratives. Better alternatives to tracking systems change include things like outcome harvesting. Now, please pay attention to the source there, cases in outcome harvesting, lessons from 10 experiences. This is from the World Bank, and they now use a case study method. So does USAID, Oxfam, and many others. And they've understood that if, in order to understand any kind of systems change, you have to set the context in a narrative. What is the problem we're trying to address, the specific objectives, and what's our analysis of the systems that need to change to generate an outcome? And then what they do is they track the cumulative effect of multiple interventions over time, where they begin to code some of the outcomes and go more deeply into them to investigate them. Now, you'll notice here that there's a bunch of boxes, green and red, and some without boxes. Here, the things without boxes are activities in the strategy. The boxes themselves are some kind of behavior change in a system actor, a policy change, new connections, a demonstration of leadership commitment. And what they do is they show how one thing led to another, and it's the accumulation of these small changes eventually that leads up to some kind of impact. Now, the other thing to note here is that every one of these boxes has both some qualitative and quantitative data within it, but at least it's offered within a context, and they are married together to give you a more fulsome understanding of what an outcome means. And so there's lots to be said on this, but long story short, if you're going to only remember two things, if you're going to understand systems change, you should use a case study format, and you almost should always be reaching for mixed methods. The last item, and I know I'm coming up on time here, is assessing contribution to systems change. So the challenge itself is pretty simple. We want to get a handle on the extent to which our activities influence some kind of outcome, our intervention leading to change. The zombie practices are highly rooted in the evaluation practices of the 60s and 70s and early 80s, which is randomized controlled trials, comparative design, and statistical modeling. It's a bit more complex than that, but not by much, because what we're trying to do is isolate the specific contribution of our intervention. Well, there's an enormous number of problems with this, partly because very few systems change interventions, I might argue almost none. I might lose that, but it's certainly most, can't use these methods. And so does that mean we only pick methods as systems change efforts that can be assessed by traditional randomized controlled trials? Do we then get lazy and assume changes are 100% attributable to our activities? That's false. Or do we ignore the question entirely because it's too hard to address? Well, that's not helpful. Even the most cynical change maker, social innovator who is not concerned about this, still kind of wants to know whether or not their activities are making a difference. So the alternatives, the better alternatives, are captured in something called contribution analysis, which was a big phrase 5-10 years ago and is becoming quite normalized now, but the practice has not been. I was going to write a paper on this, and the Center for Evaluation and Innovation beat me to it, and they prepared a much better paper than I could have produced, and it's called Lost Causal, Debunking Myths About Causal Analysis and Philanthropy. And they provide a whole range of alternative approaches organized into these 4 big clusters: theory-based, participatory-based, case-based, and systems-based approaches. All of them have pros and cons. All of them are imperfect. None of them give you a definitive answer, but they certainly reduce the fuzziness on the question of to what extent are we contributing to these changes. Everyone, that's time. I made the case that there's 3 foundational ideas to orient us to the way systems change happens that are necessary to embrace. Number 1, that the case is strong. Number 2, that it's a contested process of accumulated changes over time. That's really messy, but we have to embrace that mess. And if we don't deserve to be in the game of systems change. And number 3, that there's a lot of types of changes that we could be tracking. The zombie practices argument is really that there's a whole bunch of go-to practices and orientations to evaluation that are no longer useful, even if we do them on steroids, and that we need to find better alternatives to some common evaluation challenges. I hope it was a provocation, and I'll leave you with this question that you may or may not find useful in your discussion. What is most alive for you about thinking about this way to understand, track, and communicate the results of systems change? And so what might be some of the implications for your work? Ideas, questions, and fears. Thank you, everyone. All the best to you in the rest of your session today, and I hope this was a useful and small contribution.
Okay, so I think the message from that is evaluation's key. Find an expert who can help you do it in a way that actually ensures that you've got the expertise that you need. Now, because we're in a session on systems change, and because we're working in adaptation, we're going to have afternoon tea, because I think everybody needs it.